Solomon Drayton did not attract attention upon arrival. He parked his old black Dodge Charger, with somewhat worn paint by the years, in front of the high school gym Elmridge, and stayed some seconds in silence, looking at the entrance as if who breathed before diving. He was wearing his uniform blue marine impeccable, the same as there was used in his funeral wife. That day, however, he did not come to say goodbye to anyone. He had driven 8 hours just to fulfill a promise, to be present at his graduation. Tyron's son, on the right hand, held a photograph old, bent around the corners, where appeared he, his wife, and Tyron's still child. On the left, nothing but calm. He walked to the entrance without haste, without raising his voice, without looking at the sides, just a proud father, in silence, complying his word. If this story, it's your turn, subscribe to the channel. That allows us to continue telling stories like this. Really, we need to continue. The gym already was full. Parents, students, teachers, everyone dresses for the occasion. Solomon located his seat in the first rows. There was reserved in advance, and sat down without saying anything, straight, with his back firm and the look calm. But they hadn't passed neither 5 minutes when 2 security guards, young people, approached him. They spoke to him in low but firm voice. "You need to move to the back," they said. There was no explanation. There was no motive, just that tone that black men know well, the one that doesn't shout but pushes. Solomon then looked into my eyes. He didn't get up. He didn't protest. He just stayed there, sitting as if nothing or nobody could move it. His presence spoke by yes alone. I didn't need scandals. I didn't need permission to be where I belonged. The guards looked at each other, confused. Due to the lack of reaction, they were used to people argued, complained, made excuses, but that man offered no endurance neither. Obedience, just stillness. One of them touched your radio, hesitating. "Yeah, call the supervisor." The other crossed the arms, hoping the pressure would be enough. But Solomon didn't move. He didn't look down. There was something in his face that couldn't be explained easily. A mixture of old pain, intact dignity, and the patience of someone who has lived things further harder than one order unfair. To your around, some people began to notice what was happening, but nobody, he said. Nothing. The murmur was more of discomfort than indignation, and then something happened that no one I expected. From the part at the back of the gym, a tall man with a thick beard and a grey jacket stood up, in silence. He was not wearing uniform, but his steps had the discipline of someone who has marched in formation. He walked until he was fair behind Solomon and stood there, wordlessly. Then another, more corpulent, with a visible scar on his neck, stood up at the other end of the room. After another and another, there were 6 in total. 6 men who didn't look like have relationship to each other, distributed among the crowd, who now stood up with a synchrony strange and powerful. They were Navy SEALs, former Solomon's companions, men whom he had branded in Kandahar, dragged under fire, enemy, protected with his own body. None spoke. No one needed him. His presence, it was enough to change the local air. The guards, they took a step back, almost without realizing it account. There was something changed. It wasn't just the number of men standing, nor their physiques imposing. It was the way, what were they in there? Serene, firm, with a look fixed and the body relaxed, like if they didn't need it prove anything. The authority they carried didn't come from badges or radios. It came from something deeper, more hard to argue with. Respect earned with blood, loyalties forged in places where death was a possibility constant. The school director, she'd a man of about 50 years with a tie red and expression nervous. She approached quickly, seeing the tension. He asked that was happening. The guards, they stammered, and upon hearing he named Drayton, the director's expression changed. "Solomon Drayton," he repeated, lowering his voice, as if he suddenly understood something that had previously eluded him. This in your seat. You don't need move." And so, like a knot that is quietly loosened, the tension dissipated. The guards did not press the issue. The SEALs said nothing. One by one, they returned to their places, leaving back that moment as if nothing had happened past. But yes, there was past. The silence with which everything occurred made the ceremony would take other tone. It was no longer just a graduation. It was no longer about diplomas or speeches with cliches. It had converted into something more, a testimony, a class silent dignity. When the first students began to go up on stage, many of the presents were no longer there, looking only to the young people. They looked at Solomon, and especially at the seat where continued sitting with the same calm of the beginning, like if nothing or nobody could delete it from there. Have you experienced something similar with your father or mother? Write it down in the comments. And if you want us to continue bringing you stories, subscribe now. It costs nothing and helps us very much. Tiran, dressed in a blue gown and cap neatly, arranged, had not seen what had happened. Past. I was in the queue of the graduates, concentrated in not stumbling, in remember his name complete, in not forgetting smile for the photo. But someone whispered something to her. A friend, her eyes shining, said in low voice, "Your dad didn't let himself be moved." And some men stood up by him. Tiran frowned. He frowned at first, confused, but then something lit up in his face. He didn't need further explanations. I knew perfectly what that is meant. I knew the history of Kandahar, of the companions saved from the bullet that his father still was wearing hosted in his shoulder left, and about everything. He knew the way his father walked by his world, with dignity, with firmness, without noise. When he finally arrived his turn to cross his stage, Tiran didn't just walk, he moved forward with the chest open, like, yeah, your step will take another weight, besides that of yours own name. The host called him Tiran. Drayton. The whole room erupted in applause, but it wasn't applause common, it was longer, deeper, like, yeah, each palm knew that he was celebrating more than one graduation. They celebrated a son who honored his father, a legacy he didn't need monuments. Solomon did not applaud, he just placed his hand on his chest, where still kept the old one photograph bent, and went down slightly head, not by modesty, but for something else strong, gratitude for having arrived to that day, for having resisted, for having taught with facts what others they preach with speeches. When the ceremony was over, the crowd began to slowly disperse, parents hugging children, cameras raised, laughter nervous filling the air. Solomon stayed in your seat for a while more, waiting for Tiran to find him. He had no hurry. He was a man accustomed to wait, to observe his world move while he maintained his center. And it didn't take long a lot in see your son in the crowd, looking around. But when their eyes met, Tiran ran toward he, now without a toga or mortarboard, and hugged him tightly, with respect silent that weighed more than any words. "They told me what happened," he said. The boy, without letting go completely, said, "Why didn't you say anything?" Solomon looked at him, calm, and replied as he always did it, without embellishment. "Because I don't have to shout to be heard." That phrase, said without anger, neither drama, it stayed with him engraved. Tiran. More than any speech of the day, as they left the gym toward the parking, with the last sunrays sneaking between the trees, Tiran felt something he didn't know put in words. It wasn't just pride, it was understanding. As if he suddenly understood what his father had stayed teaching him all his life, that the true one force is not there in raise your voice, but in to hold on firm when he world try push you. The old Dodge Charger looked out of place among the cars, modern parking, but had something that no more history. Solomon opened the driver's door and waited for Tiran to get settled. In the passenger seat, inside, the air, it smelled like leather, old memories already. The board had time marks, and on the glove compartment there was a sticker already worn out sign that said, "Keep moving forward." It was the car that had belonged to his wife, the same one they used to go to the Tiran's workouts, the same in the one they had taken to his son on the first day of school. In that space closed, full of past, Father and son, they shared a silence different, not an uncomfortable one, but full of meaning. Sometimes it's hard not to explode, Tyrone admitted, looking out the window. When something is unfair, I won't say it, shout it. Solomon nodded. He understood. He had also had those impulses in his youth, but the years, the losses, the battles, at home and in the war, had taught another way of being in the world. There are times to talk, he said, and others in those who stay standing, says more than 1,000 words. Tyrone looked at him, trying to absorb every syllable as were instructions for life. It was not about keeping quiet to avoid problems. It was about choosing how and when exercise you power. That day his father had not protected with words. He had made with presence, with composure. And there was achieved something deeper, that his son understand that sometimes the greatest lesson is given without opening your mouth. As the Charger's engine purred gently, Solomon drove through the streets, quiet Elmridge, without saying much. The city already, it was getting dark, and the porch lights were beginning to come on to light one by one. Tyrone looked through the window with his toga folded on his legs, reviewing mentally everything there was past. The gym, the guards, the men who stood up without anyone the called. There was something sacred in that. Reaction silent. It wasn't just respect, it was debt, settled, it was memory, and about everything was loyalty. His father never. He spoke of Kandahar in detail, but Tyrone understood. Now that some actions are not explained, they are witnessed. As they knew you were there, he asked, suddenly breaking a silence. They didn't know, Solomon replied without taking his eyes off the road. They just came to see their children graduate. Tyrone took a long time, some seconds in process the response. There was no messages previous, nor planning, just destiny, coincidence perhaps, but one you won't forget. And yet, that's how they got up, he said, with admiration. Because there are things that are not forgotten, son, he replied his father gently. When you've bled with someone, you don't need words to know when it's time to get up. That moment taught Tyrone it's true that I didn't come in books neither classes. True brotherhood needs no explanations. It is built with actions. It is honored in his silence, and when arrives he moment, it comes out firmly. That night, watching his father drive serenely, he understood that life isn't just about hanging on. It's about doing it with grace. If you are feeling something with this story, subscribing is the best way to support us. Only this way, we will be able to continue sharing stories like this. They arrived home around 9 o'clock. It was a modest house, with a simple facade and a garden, small but well maintained. Tyrone got out of the car first, opened the door, and turned on the hall light. Solomon walked in with a calm stride, hanging his dress jacket on the he-coat rack, and left the old one photograph on the ledge. The silence between them, it was no longer distant, it was comfortable, like a conversation that didn't need to be done more words. They sat down in the living room side by side. No television, no phones, just the ticking of the clock and the calm of having crossed a line important. Solomon took out a wooden box from under the sofa. He opened it slowly, like if it were a ritual, and gave Tyrone a medal wrapped in velvet blue. This is not for he army, he explained. It's from when you saved your brother in He Lake. You had 10 years. Tyrone took it in both hands, surprised. He didn't remember her. I thought you had it lost. Never. I lose what matters, Solomon said. That little one gesture, simple but full of meaning, reminded Tyrone that his father was not just a decorated Marine. He was a man who kept the moments important, that he valued the act silent, and that, with that delivery symbolic, was telling him, I see too your value. Tyrone squeezed the medal between the fingers. Inside, something settled. It wasn't about filling his father's shoes. It was about walking in the same coherence, with the same temperance, and to honor, into his way, everything that man had taught without raising one's voice. In the morning next, Tyrone woke up before his father. The sun was setting warm through the curtains of his room, and by first time in a lot time, did not feel anxiety typical of not knowing what do with your future. He went down the stairs in silence and found Solomon in the kitchen, making coffee. He was dressed in work clothes, a flannel shirt and dark jeans, no finery, no medals, just a man starting another day. But to Tiran, everything there was changed. He observed as his father moved each thing calmly, the cup, the coffee pot, the bread. It was a choreography, silent, disciplined, a way of being in he world that said more than any speech motivational. "Want to go for a run?" Solomon asked without looking. Tiran smiled. That was his way of saying, "Let's talk." "Yes," he replied, "but this time you follow my rhythm." They both went out together, and while he neighborhood still was sleeping, they started to trot by Hussein Park, where Tiran learned to walk in bicycle. They didn't talk a lot. They just ran, breathed, shared his same rhythm, and between one step and another, Tiran began to understand that being strong is not about imposing yourself, but about persisting, that not everything is achieved with shouting or explosions of rage, that sometimes the most powerful that you can to do is to stay firm. When they returned, Tiran was sweaty, tired, but with the heart calm. There was something in that moment that sealed a cycle. It was no longer just he, son of Solomon. He was a man who was beginning to build his own path, with the guide silent of someone who always was there, even when seemed invisible. That Sunday in the afternoon, the house was filled with voices and footsteps. Relatives, neighbors, some Tiran's classmates arrived with plates of food and long hugs. It was a celebration simple, nothing ostentatious, but full of emotion. On the dining room table, on a white tablecloth, there was a printed photo of Tiran in his toga, another of him when I was a child, and a further where appeared with his mother, now deceased. No one spoke a lot of it, but his absence was felt in the air. Tiran, however, mentioned it in his first toast. "Thanks to my mum by teach me not to give up, and my dad by teach me not to move when I shouldn't." Solomon, seated in a corner with a glass of juice in his hand, he said nothing. He just lowered his head a time more. The guests looked at him with respect. No one dared to interrupt it. At those heights, all they knew what was their past at the ceremony. The rumor had spread, scattered fast, but not as fast gossip, but as example. Some parents gave him clapping on the back. Others, they just looked at him with admiration. But he continued being his same, serene, discreet, without seeking prominence. His gaze fell in Tiran, who laughed with some cousins in the patio. In its expression, there was more than just pride. There was tranquility, as if finally could rest a little, knowing that your son there was understood the essential, that one does not impose oneself with noise, but with roots. And Solomon had lying roots deep. That night, when he last guest said goodbye and the house was left in silence, Tiran and Solomon sat down in his porch. Forward, there was no moon, but he darling it was clear, dotted with stars. Tiran had a lemonade in his hand, Solomon held his coffee cup. The wood-old woman on the porch creaked with each little movement, like if it also formed part of the conversation. It was then when Tiran asked something he was carrying, time-saving. "Sometime you felt it wasn't worth it, continue struggling?" Solomon didn't respond immediately. He took a slow sip of coffee and looked toward the tree in the garden. The same as there was planted with his wife when they moved there. Its branches moved just with him wind. Finally, he spoke. "Many times," he said, "but I never said it, in voice high, because I knew that if I said it, it would become more real." Tiran looked at him in silence. He understood that his father was not invulnerable. He had just learned to carry his pain without it overflowing. That sincerity, naked and without drama, made him admire it still more. Not for his strength, but by his ability to sustain oneself standing still with a tired soul. And in that moment, without words, he promised something to himself same, that I would do the same. that I would honor that force, calm, that she would live so that her father could continue looking at him with those serene eyes, knowing that not everything that is taught is said. Some things, they just are experienced. The next day, as Solomon was checking nails tools in a garage, received a visit unexpected. He was one of the men who had up at the ceremony. Nick, the one with the thick beard and grey jacket. He wasn't wearing uniform, neither medals, just one cardboard box under the arm and a smile sincere. Solomon greeted him with a firm handshake, one that requires no words. They sat down in Nails' chairs, folding next to the car, as they had made so many times in a desert, sharing his silence before each mission. I couldn't leave without stopping by to see you. Nick said, what you did was further bigger than any battle. Solomon looked down, uncomfortable with the praise. There was no done nothing extraordinary, at least not in his eyes. He had only left sitting. But for Nick, and for everyone those who knew him before, that act there was been a reminder of values, of firmness, of who Solomon Drayton was. My son asked me by you, Nick added. I wanted to know why. That all we stopped. I said to him, because that man has already stopped by us many times. They both laughed discreetly. Then Nick handed him the box. A memory from everyone. Solomon opened it and inside found a flag folded, one team photo complete in Afghanistan, and a plate recorded with a single phrase, "He who does not need speak to be heard." At that moment, something in his chest loosened. It was recognition. Yes, but also relief, knowing that his history, its way of being, there was no past unnoticed, that still in a silence, others followed listening. That night, Solomon placed the box with the flag and the photograph about a shelf in his fourth next to the portrait of his wife. It was not a trophy case, nor a display of glory. It was a small personal altar, a place where rested the things that really mattered. As I looked at the plaque with the phrase recorded, recalled the day he saved Nick. He didn't do it by recognition. He did it because it was the right thing to do, just as there was made by staying sitting in that ceremony. And now I understood that those actions, by further silent as they were, they left brands in the others, brands that were worn in his heart, not in medals. The next day, at school secondary Elmridge, something different had happened. The director, a woman of voice firm and gaze, Clara, started the day with a short speech in the intercom. Today we want to recognize the fathers and mothers who were there present at the graduation ceremony, especially to a man who, he taught that dignity does not need permission. He didn't say his name, but all they knew who spoke. Even the students' further youths they started asking by he veteran who didn't move. Social media was filled with comments. Some videos were circulating showing the SEALs standing up, and although Solomon wasn't looking attention, your gesture became in symbol, not for what he did, but for what it represented. The strength to stay firm when it is more easy to give in. Tyron noticed he changed even among his peers. Those who previously saw him only as a student silent, now they looked at him with a mixture of respect and curiosity. Some approached him to ask by his father. Others, they just gave it to him a slap on the back as he passes. But more beyond attention momentarily, something deeper was there occurred inside him. He no longer walked, curved neither. He hesitated when speaking. There was acquired a presence different, as if the roots that his father had sown finally would have sprouted. In one of her classes, the history teacher asked her to write an essay about an act of bravery. Tyron did not hesitate. He wrote about that day, but not as a son proud, but as a witness to something that transformed his way of seeing the world. Solomon read his rehearsal days later, sitting in his same usual porch. The words of his son were clear, unadorned. They spoke of respect, of firmness, of legacy, and for first time in a lot time, felt that everything there was, it was worth it. The nights lonely, the absences, the scars, both visible as invisible. Everything had driven at that moment to see his son understand that life is not always won with strength, but with integrity. He folded it carefully and put it away in the same box where there were the flag and the plaque. I didn't need show it to anyone. It was enough to know that Tyran had done it written, that he had sense, that there was lived, and that, for him, was enough. The weeks passed, and the story was losing force on the networks, such as it happens with everything viral. But in Elmridge, and especially at the Drayton House, the impact remained alive. Tyran began working part-time in a local bookstore, while preparing to apply for a university state. It was not the brighter, nor he further extroverted, but somewhat in he called the attention of the clients. Your way of listening, your presence calm, your eye respect by he time of the others. Some even they asked, yeah, there was state in the army, which caused him a smile discreet. No, she replied always, but I went servant by someone who was there. And in that phrase, fit all, Solomon, by his part, returned to his same old routine. I was working fixing engines, cutting wood on weekends, helping the neighbors without asking for anything in return. He did it in silence, like all in his life, but now something had changed. More people greeted him on the street. Some young people from the neighborhood would stop to talk to him, to ask him advice, or simply to listen to their stories. And although he didn't look for that role, he accepted it with the same dignity with which he had accepted all in his life, with firm feet on the ground. Tyran watched him from a distance, noticing as his father, without intending to, had converted into a reference, not for his words, but by his example, because there are men who inspire from he podium and others who do from he porch. Did you get this far? Then please do something for this channel. Subscribe, comment, or share. It's what keeps us going. One Saturday in the afternoon, while father and son they cleaned together he garage, Tyran found a box metallic rusty. Inside there was cassette tapes, some with labels handwritten, Afghanistan, Christmas, SEAL Training, 2003, Voices from Camp. He looked at it curiously, as if who finds part of a life parallel that always was there, but about which little was known. Solomon, noticing what he had in his hands, stopped for a second. Then he nodded and said, "We can hear them, if you want." That night, sitting in front of an old recorder, they heard voices mixed with static, laughter between gunshots, and off-key singing between battle comrades. Tyran did not questions, he just listened, in silence, like who presence of something sacred. That experience the joined still more, not because of the war stories, but due to vulnerability shared. For the first time, once again, Tyran felt his father open his eyes, a door that previously held closed, not by distrust, but by protection. And Solomon understood that his son, he was no longer a child who needed to be sheltered, but a man ready to understand. At the end of the last tape, neither of them said anything. They just stood there, in the room, looking sealing, breathing slowly. Because there are things that don't need to be explained. It's enough to have them vivid together. And that moment, among echoes of a past difficult, it was also a pact silent. Now they walked side by side, without hierarchies, just two men, connected by a story that was no longer just one's own. Days later, Solomon was invited to speak in a school neighbor. At first, he hesitated. He didn't consider himself a speaker, and much less someone who should. Stop in front of young people to give lessons, but Tyran encouraged him. "You don't have to teach them anything," he said. "Just show them who you are." Reluctantly, he agreed. The audience was full of high school students, restless and scattered, like any group of teenagers. Solomon walked onto the stage with a firm step, without papers, without a projector, just him, his calm voice, and a history. He told what happened at his graduation, son, not so that they would admire him, but so that they would understand something that he had taken years learn, that it is not always necessary raise your voice to change the course of something, that the true authority doesn't shout, it stands, it builds every day with acts small. At first, the boys looked at him without much interest, but as he spoke, the silence was growing. Some stopped looking at their cell phones. Others, they started to take notes. When he finished, there was no ovation, just a round of applause, slow, deep. And that was enough for him, because he wasn't looking for applause. I was looking to plant an idea, one that could stay in the mind from to minus one of them. And while came down from the stage, he understood something important. His story was not just his, it was a seed. That night, on my way back. At home, Solomon left his jacket about his support of a chair and poured himself a glass of water. Tyron was waiting for him, in the room, anxious to know how there was left everything. When his father told him, without exaggeration, just with that calm that characterized him, Tyron smiled. "I knew you were going to make me. They will listen, even if you don't say anything much." Solomon looked at him with an eyebrow raised. "I didn't say little, just what was necessary." And they both laughed, as if that exchange confirmed that they were seeing he world from his same place. It was a kind of understanding that is only achieved when the words have been replaced by experiences. In the following days, Solomon began receiving letters, some of gratitude, others asking counsel. Young people who had heard his history was written for him things like, "Thank you for show us another way to be strong," or "I want learn to support myself like this," without losing his cool. He didn't know exactly how to respond to all of them, but he took it time to read each one. And although continued repairing cars and sweeping his workshop with the same usual routine, there was something different in his way of walking by the neighborhood. The people, he no longer just recognized him, he was searching for him. And without meaning to, Solomon had converted in, referring to something that he never there was planned to be. An example, not because it was perfect, but because there was lived with coherence. And that, in a world of noise, became each time further valuable. One afternoon, while Solomon fixed a bicycle for his neighbor's son, Tyron sat down in the entrance step with a notebook in the hands. They were started to write, not poetry, nor novel, nor speeches, just thoughts, fragments of what I felt, of what I had learned seeing his father. He did it without any intention of publishing it, just as a way of organizing his mind. But that late, something changed. Closed his notebook, approached Solomon and said, "I want to write about you, about what you taught me," without saying it. Solomon looked up and for a moment seemed surprised, but then he nodded, as if to accept that there are things that deserve to be told. "Do it," he replied, "but don't write to be admired. Write to be remembered. By what is worth it, stay firm." Tyron understood the difference. It wasn't about counting a heroic story, but a history honest, one that would show that strength is not always comes accompanied by gestures great, but of perseverance silent. So began to give shape to what would be his first long essay. He shared it with his literature teacher, who encouraged him to submit it in a regional competition. I didn't expect win, but when he did, the first thing he thought was in his father. He went up on stage to receive his award with a copy of the essay in his hand and the childhood medal that Solomon had given him returned. And when they interviewed him, he only said a phrase, "Everything I am, I learned seeing my dad keep standing." With the time, the Tyron's essay began to circulate more beyond the contest. It was shared in education forums, in veterans groups, including in a page national about leadership silent. People from different parts of the country began to write to him, not only to congratulate him, but to ask further about Solomon. And although Tyron he responded with respect, never deviating from his main message. "My father doesn't want a recognition. He just wants the world. Understand that there is another way to resist." Solomon, by his part, continued his unaltered life rhythm. But each time I saw her son write, speak or act with that calm that had so much instilled, felt that his legacy no longer depended on his presence. There was lying roots in other body, in another path. One morning, Solomon received an invitation local government official. They wanted granted a Medal of Honor for his contribution, civic and moral example for youth. The letter was formal with stamps and signatures important. He read it in silence, folded it and left it on the table without saying anything. When Tyron found it, he read it with enthusiasm. "Are you going to go?" Solomon thought about it some seconds and responded with a half smile. "Only if you accompany me." And so was. Father and son, they went up to the stage together, without long speeches, without gestures exaggerated. Solomon accepted the medal with the same expression with which he had resisted all in his life, serene, firm, grateful. Not for recognition in yes, but because now I understood that, although I hadn't wanted, his way of being in he world there was shocked more than I imagined. That night, on my way back at home, Solomon placed the medal in the same shelf where the flag, the team photo and the plaque of his teammates were resting there. He didn't like them, the altars personal, but I understood that each of those objects had a history. And together they told something more bigger than him same. One life lived with purpose. Tyran watched from the kitchen in silence. He no longer saw only his father. He saw a complete man, with his wounds, his renunciations and his coherence. An example that did not need to be repeated verbatim, but adapted to your own way of walking. "Do you regret anything?" Tyran asked, almost in a whisper. Solomon was taking his time before answering. Then he shook his head. "Only from the days when I doubted myself same." That phrase was left floating in the air as a confession. Tyran said nothing, but she vowed inside not to repeat that mistake, because she had seen him resist, she had seen him get up, and above all, everything, I had seen it remain. And if his father, with all that he had faced, could look in the mirror without regrets deep, then he could too try it. Because the value is not always this in do more, but in to hold on to what one already is, firmly and without fear. The day Tyran received his college acceptance letter, Solomon was in his garden rear, repairing the fence. The envelope was white, with the university logo in the top corner. Tyran opened it with trembling hands and read in voice, "Hi, there was been accepted." The first thing he did was go out in a hurry toward the patio, where his father followed crouching, nailing a table. He didn't scream, he didn't cry, he just hugged him. From behind, with a force that contained everything he felt, Solomon stay still for a second, like will need confirm that it was real, and then turned to hug him too. "You did it," he said. "We did it," Tyran corrected. They both knew that moment was not just a conquest academic. It was the confirmation that everything he way by further hard that there would be been, had been, it was worth it. Solomon handed him over a key, small, rusty hanging. From its key ring from toward years. "It's for him car, now it's yours." Tyran took it with reverence, not because the car in yes, but for what it meant. It was the last inheritance from his mother, the vehicle in the one who had learned so many lessons. Some inside the car, others in a path, and upon receiving it, he understood that he was not only beginning a new stage, I was continuing a history, a story that didn't begin with him, but now belonged to him. The morning of his departure, Tyran said goodbye to each corner of the house, like were old friends. He played his doorframe, where his mother used to write down his height, stopped in front of the family portrait in the living room, and then went out to the porch, where Solomon was already waiting for him. There were no grandiloquent words, no endless hugs, just a firm handshake, followed by a brief silence. "You're going to be fine," said Solomon, looking at his son straight into the eyes. "Because you taught me how," Tyran replied. He got into the Charger, started at the engine, and lowered the window. Before leaving, he looked by last look at his father, who was still standing next to them steps, with the arms crossed and head held high. He didn't say, "You I want," in voice high. He didn't do it missing. In that exchange of glances, everything was saying. During the way, Tyran thought in the many silences that there were shared with his father. On the occasions when a gesture there was saying more than advice. In the moments in which to stay still there was been the most powerful to speak, and he understood that his mission now was to transmit that to the world, not as a sermon, but as a way of life. A way I wasn't looking for applause, but left footprint, that I didn't need titles to carry weight, that he didn't need shout to be heard. On his first day at university, while other students they were talking about parties, schedules and bedrooms, Tyron hung up on the wall of his room only one thing: the medal that his father had given him returned, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Every time I looked at her, I felt again the weight of that ceremony, the silence of the seals rising, the calm with which Solomon refused to move. He didn't need further motivation. That was enough to remind him who was, where from, came and went, where wanted to go. That same one afternoon, in an ethics class, the teacher asked the students who will name to someone who represented them the concept of integrity. Some, they said, figures public, others mentioned philosophers or activists. Tyron raised his hand without hesitation. "My father," he said, "he's not famous, nor has he written books, but he is the most whole that I know. He taught me that staying firm, even when it is difficult, you can change further things you imagine." The classroom was left in silence, not for amazement, but by respect, because in his there was no voice presumption, just truth. And in that instant, without fully knowing it, Tyron began to occupy his own place in his world, not like a copy of Solomon, but as a living extension of his teachings. A young man who walked with a firm step, not because of the height of his voice, but because of the depth of its roots. Back in Elmridge, Solomon continued with his life as always, pruned the trees in the neighborhood, helped in the church the Sundays, and fixed children's bicycles that couldn't pay them. Never I talked about what there was passed at the ceremony, neither of the government medal, nor of the letters that followed arriving. But each time someone greeted him with more respect for the usual, he just nodded with a mild smile. I knew that her history there was out of his control, but it didn't bother him, because never was about he. It was about what can be done, teach without imposing, about what is transmitted with the example, about what remains when one remains firm. One afternoon, while the sun was setting behind the low houses of the neighborhood, Solomon sat in a porch with a cup of tea. He looked at the sky. He breathed deep and closed eyes for a moment. He remembered his wife and to his companions fallen, to his son now walking his own path, and he felt peace. Because I didn't need it more. I wasn't looking for monuments, nor statues, nor speeches. I just wanted to know what was there, left something valuable. And he had done, in each Tyron's gesture, in each young man who now I knew that I would resist in silence is also a way of speaking. In every person who understood, thanks to him, that the true force is not imposed, it is sown, and if it is sown well, it is never forgotten. Weeks later, Tyron wrote a last letter. He didn't send it to any contest, nor did he publish it. He folded it carefully and left it on the shelf, among his father's things, during a visit quickly home. In it he said, "Thank you for never move when all they expected you to do it. Thanks for teach me that courage is not in overcome, but in hold on. If I ever have children, I want you to see me as I see you." Solomon found the letter the next day. He didn't cry. He just sat with it, in the hands during several minutes, in silence, and with the expression that mixed gratitude and peace. And so, without the need for large gestures, without cameras, neither speeches, the story of Solomon Drayton was written in the places that really are important, in the memory of his son, in his respect for your community, and in each young man who learned that the true power is not shouted. It takes root, because there are men who pass for life leaving noise, and others that leave foundations. Solomon was of the seconds, and four, that although he did not seek to be remembered, never will be forgotten. If this story left a mark on you, I ask you from the bottom of my heart, subscribe to the channel, not out of vanity, but so we can continue spreading stories like this one.